Okay, so in this video, we are going to be looking at the transition of the Anti-Federalists into the Democratic Republicans. So I normally you'll see me just reference them as the Republicans. They're also known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. The full name is the Democratic Republicans. Okay, this is not the Republican Party of the 21st century, or really the Democratic Party of the 21st century. All right, our political parties change and evolve over time, but in the 1790s, again, Anti-Federalists and Federalists is just about whether the Constitution should be passed and ratified. Our first two-party system is going to be the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. Okay. Now, the Democratic Republicans will use a lot of similar arguments to what the Anti-Federalists were using, but it's not. It's about the power and authority of the government under the Constitution. At this point, there's no getting rid of the Constitution without another revolution and government overthrow. But the Republicans are going to start gaining favor, especially as Hamilton continues to sort of openly advocate elitism. Hamilton, in particular, gets attacked for his economic plan, the impact that his plan has on disproportionately on impacting poor farmers, small farmers, farmers in the West. There's a real tag of elitism towards the Federalists and the executive branch in general. The Democratic Republicans are going to advocate things like small government, larger power staying within the state government. So again, a lot of the system that you saw during the American Revolution. But one thing that the Republicans do not have going for them in the first few years under the Constitution is George Washington. Okay, George Washington was unquestionably the most popular political figure in this era, in this time period. And even his political opponents were aware of this. Okay, so Washington, if you remember, during the Constitutional Convention, was unanimously chosen to be the president of that convention. He gets elected as president, first president under the Constitution. He gets elected again in 1792 for a second term. And that he's the biggest safety net for the Federalists. Okay. In 1796, he decides to retire from public life. Oh, excuse me. So at this point, Washington's super old. He's gone through a lot of different changes in this new country, but also his first term relatively successful. He's still relatively popular. His second term was less successful, but he was still popular. If he would have run for a third term in office, he probably would have done it and probably would have won. But Jefferson, for example, becomes like the leading Democratic Republican. He can't come out and criticize George Washington openly. Now he's writing letters to friends and things, and he's sort of challenging Washington as much as possible. He can say things like, Washington's, maybe he's getting up there in years. Maybe he should retire. Maybe he's losing it a little bit. He would love to just come out and say Washington is terrible president, Federalists are terrible, but as long as Washington's in power, he can't do that. When Washington retires, it is an open door to a battle between these two groups. Okay, and Adams is going to be chosen to run for the Federalists. Okay, now he'd been vice president under Washington. Hamilton has more political power and is probably more influential with the Federalist Party, but he was too unpopular even amongst his own party. Now, Adams was also fairly unpopular just because and Hamilton and Adams both, it's their personality, right? And Hamilton's ambition and his planning, that makes him unpopular. Adams is just really grumpy, and really honest, really blunt, very curmudgeonly, right? These are the two leading candidates. So Adams gets chosen, but one thing that Adams has going for him is unquestioned contributions to the American Revolution. No one who's a Democratic Republican can look at John Adams and say he did not support independence. So again, we're coming back to this idea of the ideological battles of the American Revolution. They can start challenging him on violating those principles, but he has that clout and support from Americans, especially in New England, the area that he is from. So in 1796, there's a contentious election going on, and the Federalists are still in power, and Adams is going to win, but it's a much closer battle than any presidential election to that point. Now, what happens, we've changed this system in part because of what happens here, but the way the initial election process was set up is whoever finished second would become the vice president. Okay, so Adams didn't run with a vice president nominee. Jefferson became his vice president. Imagine a scenario where this election that we're in, right, we're in an election year, comes up, and Donald Trump and Joe Biden are running for office. Whoever comes in second is the other's vice president. Imagine what that would be like for a second, because that's what is happening here in 1796. The party division is pretty tight. It's pretty divided. It's pretty tense. And Jefferson is going to undermine his presidency as much as possible. Now, Adams there's a few things just stacked against Adams immediately. First of all, no matter who wins this election, they're coming in after George Washington, okay? It's like, a talent show or a concert, right? If you go to a concert, and a band does really awesome, great show, great performance, the next band might be afraid to follow that up, right? Or might be criticized for not living up to the high standards, and that's sort of no matter what, you're being compared to George Washington, and neither of these people are as popular as George Washington. Okay, so that's a problem. He also doesn't have the protection that Washington's reputation had. That's also a problem. He also has the problem that he can be unpopular with people personally, but he's also going to be making some political missteps along the way. Now, one thing that comes up, and this came up under Washington, the French Revolution. If you remember, France intervened in the American Revolution and was an ally of the United States. Washington, after the French Revolution breaks out, and the French Revolution is a good contrast to the American Revolution because it spirals out of control and gets really violent, really bloody. The initial revolutionary group is not revolutionary enough, and then they are replaced. And so it devolves, like many revolutions do, into political turmoil and chaos, and by the 1790s has devolved into a larger war. And they look to the United States for intervention and assistance in helping the French fight against the British. And Washington says no. That's it. He just flat out refuses. And he advises in his farewell address for the United States to remain neutral and avoid being entangled in European affairs. And so that was his stance on it. Many Americans were kind of not on board with this because France had intervened, all these ideas of rights and independence and revolution, anti-monarchy, all that rhetoric and propaganda of the revolution is still resonating with Americans, right? The Revolutionary War propaganda campaign was so successful that Americans still today use it in everyday understandings of the United States. But Washington sets this precedent, right? We're not going to get involved. And Adams he looks at this and says, okay, if that's good enough for Washington, that's good enough for me. We're not going to get involved. The Federalists continue to lose power. The Democratic Republicans continue to challenge the Federalists on this stance. Jefferson, in particular, is on board with the French Revolution and intervention, and he's challenging Adams. The Federalists are being accused of basically wanting to reinstitute a monarchy. Things continue to get out of hand. The French Revolution, or the United States, eventually comes under attack from both France and Britain. Adams sends representatives to discuss the matter with French officials. It's known as the XYZ affair. It backfires completely, and France basically tries to bribe the extort the United States, extort money in exchange for protection. It gets disastrous. Adams passes the Alien and Sedition Acts to curtail opposition to him, to prevent the press and various people in the country from speaking out or challenging him and the Federalists. At this point, the Democratic Republicans are growing in popularity, and oppressive laws from a newly powerful central government becomes really easy target for the Democratic Republicans. They accuse them of being basically the same as the British, all of these things, right? It gets to the point that with the help of Thomas Jefferson, who was the vice president at this, during this whole Adams term in office, Virginia and Kentucky propose resolutions giving the states right to nullify federal laws that are seen as excessive in power. Now, again, these are rejected, but it introduces a theory of nullification, which we will talk about later, that a state has the right to nullify a federal law that they disagree with. That's based, Jefferson and Madison are basing these on anti-federalist arguments from the 1780s. They're basing it on the ideas from the Revolution, and they're doing it to challenge the Federalists in the federal government. So this is all one term in office, right? In 1800, there's going to be another presidential election, and Adams is going to run, and it's going to be borderline disastrous, okay? So in the election of 1800, Adams is chosen to run for the Federalists. At this point, Hamilton is not going to get the nomination. The Federalists figure at least stick with the guy who got us here, even though he's not as popular as he was coming into office. He is still hugely popular in the Northeast, in the North, and that will help sort of garner some votes. But the Federalists are at this point really targeted as being in opposition to the French Revolution, as loving monarchies, as trying to team up with the British, all these things, right? And the campaign is about as ugly as the campaign is today. So again, if you look at the campaigning that you see in the 21st century, you see a lot of people sort of upset with the way people campaign and the smear campaigns, all that stuff. We haven't changed that much. There's a drunk history video that goes along with this content that I use because it's really funny, but it also really speaks to how this election went, right? It was really bitter, really volatile. A lot of slandering went into this election. Now, for what it's worth, Adams doesn't even finish third. Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson finished tied for the most votes, which means the House has to break up the tie. The Federalists still control the House of Representatives at this point. Alexander Hamilton is the Speaker of the House, and he uses his power to swing the votes towards Thomas Jefferson, a person he hates, but a person he hates less than he hates Aaron Burr. That's going to come back to haunt Alexander Hamilton in a few years, which we will talk about at some point down the road. But In 1800, Thomas Jefferson wins the election. At this point, going into the 1800s, the Democratic Republicans have sort of assumed the power of the federal government and will start to change the course of what the government is going to be doing. On the way out of office, John Adams attempts to bolster the Federalist power in the federal government, and the best way he can do that is by appointing judges to the judiciary and appointing John Marshall to the Supreme Court. Again, in the 21st century, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of debates and discussions about presidents and nominating justices, those sorts of things. Adams, on his way out of office, he sees what's happening. He's aware that the Federalists are losing their power, but he also believes the Federalists are still the party that has the best interests of not only America, but the principles of the Revolution in mind. So he appoints John Marshall to the Supreme Court to help bolster the Federalists in the judicial branch. And then he retires. He leaves. He does not stick around for Jefferson's inauguration. Adams and Jefferson had been really good friends, and by 1800, they don't speak for over a decade. Right? That's how intense and how personal this election gets. And that's it. After the election of 1800, the Thomas Jefferson is in office. The Democratic Republicans have assumed the power of the federal government, and they will start to enact their vision of what the American Revolution looked like going forward into the United States.